Good evening and welcome to our Feeder Alignment Committee meeting. Welcome and Happy New Year to everyone. We appreciate you for spending time with us tonight. We have a different phase that we're getting ready to move forward in. I want to thank all of our committee members, community members, our parents who have come together, who have done a lot of the yeoman's work moving forward. We're so very, very pleased with all of the input that you've been able to provide and all the work that you've done. The next layer in the phase of what we're doing in terms of our Feeder Alignment Committee, we are now engaging with 3 of our board members to add the board perspective to this process. And so we are very excited to welcome 3 of our board members, President Ann Savage, Secretary Dr. Sridhar Shatur, and Member Almin Yahweh. We are so very happy to have the 3 of you join us. And tonight we are also joined by Dr. Robin, who will talk to us a little bit more about the process. And before we get to that point, I'd like to turn the time over to President Savage to provide us with a little more of an introduction.
So thank you very much. I just wanted to thank everyone, as the superintendent did, for being here today, and just appreciate the work that this community has done over the last 5 or 6 years to really define who we want to be as a district, in particular going way back to defining ourselves as a district that wanted to be a K-5, 6-8 district, which is the objective is to normalize some of the inequities, or de-inequitize, there's a word that I have not tried to say before, some of the problems we've had in our district with equity over the years. And that was one of the fundamental reasons we wanted to go to a K-5, 6-8 model, and also to reduce some of the disruptions we've been having in our middle schools with that bifurcated model, with some students entering at 6th and some at 7th. That decision was made a couple of years ago through a community process. There was a second community process which we used to define the location of this new middle school that we will need, which we ultimately sited at North Albany. And thanks to a insight by board member Krejci, who's not here tonight, we developed what we called Scenario E+, which gives us the flexibility to plan for middle schools of almost any possible enrollment, that we can have 3 similar sized middle schools as long as our enrollment stays under a certain level. 3 times, say, 650 would fit relatively easily. Or if necessary, that we can continue to expand into a 4th middle school, which when we made this decision, we thought was very, very likely. Now our enrollment is down a bit. It looks like we're going to fit in 3 middle schools, but I love the way we planned for that flexibility. That brought us to the next phase, which began this past school year and summer, and I thank the members of the Feeder Pattern Alignment Committee who are here tonight for the preliminary work they did, trying to think through the hard questions of how we decide which schools, which elementary schools will go to which middle schools, given our historic structure. I know from the board's perspective, our goal with all that we do is equity, meaning providing the services that every single child needs in a way that can serve that child. And so we are looking for a way to serve all of the children equally to their need, as opposed to equally to their inputs. And it's a non-trivial exercise, because it's a very difficult decision about how to move middle school alignments, because it's very difficult. Change is hard for everyone, and so we hope to find a way that we can provide equity to our students with a minimum of disruption as much as possible. And for that reason, we are so lucky and grateful to have Mr. Robin here to help support us in some of the data work that we need to do and the analysis that needs to be done to make those decisions. And I'm going to use that as my segue back to the superintendent. I'm not sure how you want to proceed next.
I think that we can go ahead. I know that we're waiting for one more committee member to join us, and we'll continue to work behind the scenes to have him log on. But Dr. Robin, I think if we can just go ahead and turn it over to you, and you can just kind of talk us through the process and, you know, some of the logic behind what you have developed based on the work that was handed over to you. If you could just talk us through your process. Thank you.
Certainly. Thank you, Superintendent. Thank you, President Savage. Just briefly, not to impress anybody, but so that you know, I'm coming at this with some experience and having worked with the school district for a good deal of time. I've been working with CSEA data for about 15 years. By way of, I started my career in New Jersey doing early education research on quality and cost and access issues around state-funded preschool. And then I worked at SUNY here in Albany for 13 years at the Center for Human Services Research, doing evaluation and analysis work, largely skewing towards the education field over the years. So I'm familiar, at least from the data perspective, with the history of CSDA and kind of how we've arrived where we are to some degree. My lane is very much the numbers. So when Superintendent Adams said she wanted a data-driven model that would, to the extent possible, create 3 equal middle schools, it was like the bat signal went up to me. And that's, you know, that I think, I hope, is my wheelhouse. And I've built a preliminary model that I've piloted, and it seems to work well. So I'd like to just talk you through that, and I'm happy to try to answer questions afterwards. And I'm, of course, curious what everybody's thoughts and perspectives will be on the model. So I went at this, to me, there were 3 primary questions that had to be answered. First is, who are we going to include? Which students are we going to feed into the model? And from an evaluation best practice standpoint, I decided to focus on 5th graders, thinking of, if the elementary buildings are really our unit of analysis for this model, then each elementary building is kind of a program or a multi-year intervention unto itself. And the 5th graders, not to objectify students, but the 5th graders are essentially the outputs of that intervention. So to use 3rd or 4th grade data would introduce more error than predictive power in my mind. So the answer to that first question to me was focus on grade 5. Now, to build a sample, the next question was, what years are we going to include? And to say the least, the last few years have not exactly been normal operations for any district. Usually when we try to create a longitudinal trajectory for anything that we've looked at in the past, we go back 3 years. The past 3 years have had some really unique contextual challenges. So I decided to go back to school year 19, and when I use those numbers, that represents the year that the school year ended. So school year 19 was the last uninterrupted, quote unquote, normal school year that we had. School year 20 was abbreviated, and we don't really have data from the spring of that year. School year 21 was unique in that we had the virtual and in-person split at the elementary level. And now school year 22, we have Q1 data logged so far. So all of those 4 data sets were all pulled into the model. We have about 650 5th graders each year. That would mean for each indicator in the model, we have close to 2,500 individual pieces of information. And I'll speak later, we actually have 42 indicators. So we get up towards close to 100,000 points of data. Not saying that to make anyone gasp, it's just a large sample size, and an amount of data like that creates a more robust model. It increases your validity, your reliability, and it protects against some specific limitations that you find in the data. For example, in the academic domain, we pulled in report card grades, NWEA percentiles, and New York State assessment scores. None of those are perfect indicators. Each one has some inconsistency built into it. Report cards is very, very hard to establish true standardization or objectivity in report card grades. The NWEA, when it's administered in a virtual setting, is not the standardized procedure for administration, so that can introduce some inconsistency. We know with the state test, the test has changed over the years. We know that there's opt-out issues. So the point is, by including multiple angles, the hope is that you create a really comprehensive picture of the students and the operation of the school as a unit or as a system that's educating these students. In terms of the data that was included, I don't know how specific we want to get. You probably don't need to know all 42 indicators, but what I did was aggregate among those 42 indicators to create a weighted report card total, an NWEA total, and a state test total. For attendance, we have attendance percentages and a variable of just the percent of students in each school with an attendance percentage above 90. The rationale there, and I use this in several domains, is to have one continuous and one categorical variable, which can be important. I've spoken with other district administrators about this over the years. They function really differently. But in terms of thinking about the resource demand on a school, it's very different if a school has 100 students who score 50 or 50 students who score 150 who score 0. So it can kind of, when you have both a continuous and a categorical variable, it lets you know about the distribution. And are you dealing with a more mild problem that's widespread, or a really targeted, deeper problem that's among a smaller group of students? And when you see a divergence among the continuous and categorical variables, it starts to give you that kind of information. So I thought it was worth including one of each for each year. So we have 8 attendance variables, 2 for each year. I use discipline counts for a student behavior variable. I didn't include school year 21 in that because most buildings didn't really seem to track discipline counts, probably because of the virtual and in-person nature of that year. But the data didn't look clean or reliable enough, so I didn't put that in the model. So we have 3 years of total discipline counts. And then the fourth major domain is just risk total, and that is this risk factor that's a CSDA built metric. I believe Tricia Wolf led the charge in building this, and I've always really liked it. It's been around for a few years now. It's really comprehensive, and it includes the academic pieces, the attendance, and the behavioral pieces, but it's a little broader than that as well. It specifically includes metrics around retention and suspension. It really is pretty comprehensive, and I thought would be a worthwhile add to the model. So what we ended up with is every school being ranked, so a number from 1 to 11, in an academic domain, an attendance domain, a behavior domain, and a risk domain. I then created a total school score, total school ranking that was weighted 50% academic, 20% attendance, and then 15% behavioral and 15% risk score. So each school has a final number between 1 and 11. It's usually it'd be like 1.56 or 6.30 because it's an aggregation of a whole bunch of rankings. And then by ordering the schools that way, it's a good starting point to start to say, all right, we can start with maybe put 1 and 12, 2 and 11, kind of, like March Madness, except I guess this would be September Madness. That, of course, that doesn't work completely cleanly because there are certain rules you have to follow. Some schools are larger than others. All of the rankings, when you group schools, are weighted by the size of the school based on the number of 5th graders currently in the building. When I say the rankings seem to work well, I ran actual data through the model, so not just using the rankings, but saying if we had actually created these schools and these 4 cohorts of 5th graders had gone in these groupings, what would our reality look like now in terms of grades, NWEA, attendance, et cetera? And the schools seem to be pretty much in the right order. And when you make the groups, make the ranking, the final group ranking as close as possible, it also pulls the data together. So the rankings seem to be working with the data. So in other words, if I can create 3 groups where the average school ranking is 5.8 or close to 5.8, when I run the data, the academics, attendance percentages, and risk totals are very close to the same. And the farther apart those rankings get, the farther apart the data get. So using that model, we can plug in any number of hypotheticals we want now. Any groupings, in terms of which groups would go to which middle schools, I just use Google driving directions and the shortest driving directions to come up with a total distance for transportation. but like the model is meant to be really flexible, and since it's the way it's built right now, it's very easy. I just have to change a few numbers and we can change the groupings and try out different schools in different places. So that's, if that made any sense, I hope it did. That's how it works. And like I said, it's initial returns look like it's operating pretty well.
So Dr. Robin, I know I don't want you to have to repeat everything, but sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words. I am happy to share the screen with the spreadsheets, and you can kind of do now that you've done it so that we have all heard it, we can now look at each of those tabs with just a brief explanation again of what each of those are. If I share the screen and share the spreadsheet, would you be willing to go back through those tabs and just kind of do another just high level overview of what the ranking was, what the demographics, I mean, not the demographics, but the distance and those kinds of things so that the committee can look at it on the screen as well?
Of course, I didn't know if you wanted to do that tonight, but yeah, I'd be happy to. Yes,
I am happy to drive if you would like. I can definitely share.
While we're doing that, I'm getting some sort of a weird double screen. So everything that I see is very small. I'm seeing it's labeled live event, and I'm seeing like Kuita getting smaller and smaller into the distance. So anything you share will be very, very difficult for me to read, and I'm seeing a lot of nodding. So I think everybody's having that experience. So it's sort of like some sort of like master screen that people use to it's like somebody shared their Teams screen, maybe. I don't know.
Okay.
Well, the screen is labeled Ron, so it has to be Ron Lesko.
Aha, well, there you go. I didn't even notice that.
And it is, and I will try to change it. I don't want to mess it up, but here goes nothing.
Do you want me to try to share?
If you click on another person's box, Ron's box should go off to the side and everybody else should become larger. The problem is when Mrs. Adams attempts to share, it may still show up on Ron's screen, but it's at least worth a try.
Oh, thanks, Nestle. That's very helpful. So let's see what happens when.
And I'm sharing the content screen, not my screen. Well, I'll try and click into the other me and see what happens.
Okay.
I have a request control button, but I'm very hesitant to push it.
Click send live, not get rid of the queue.
Clicking someone else's box is really helpful. That completely changed the view.
Yeah. While we're getting the sharing, I know that one of the questions that that Dan had asked some time ago, and that I had also, is that you seem to have done the analysis on 11 schools, but we have decoupled the dual language program from DCS. And so when I count, I get 12 because I count DCS as a separate school. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on about how to, and yes, that looks beautiful, Superintendent, we can see. But how that concept of 12 schools versus 11 schools works into your thinking.
When we run the models from now on, I'll pull out dual as though it's a 12th school.
Okay. So I know the superintendent has shared this. I think that's really, we have to be really careful about that because anything that we see here, DCS right now includes both the dual students and the non-dual students, right? So we would need to, when we get to the next level of this, we'll have 12 things, DCS, non-dual, and dual alone, right?
Well, the duals are no longer just at DCS, right? If this is by assigned school.
Well, if this is looking, I guess it depends. Again, you know what's going on under the hood, but any prior data from not this school year, but any prior school year, I don't know. Actually, did you take? I apologize for my lack of understanding. Did you take school summaries, or did you take student information and summarize them by their current school?
This is all individual student data. So the school year 19 is whatever school we're assigned to that year. So
that means that they're because the dual students, I think, are tied to their home school. They're sprinkled throughout here, and they're gonna change everything, right, when they get pulled out. Although there aren't very many of them, so they won't change them a lot. Right?
No, they will. I think it'll be minimal because we have so many students in here now and so many data points in here. Also, the dual students are not particular outliers in terms of the district as a whole. DCS numbers might change a little bit, but the model should function the same way. But I will pull dual out in future versions of this.
That's super helpful.
This first page shows the rankings that I was talking about, and the 42 indicators are listed in row 4 there. So you see report card grades. There's 4 for English, 19, 20, 21, 22, and then those are pulled into a single English total. In row 17, I'm looking at my pointers, though you can see it, but I guess you can't. The weighting shows you, normally I would weight more current years more heavily than I am here, but we only have 1/4 of data for the actual students who we're talking about who will be transitioning next year. So there's no magical formula to the weighting. It was really just something that made sense statistically and practically to me. So the weighting is 20, 20, 25, 35 across these years to create a report card English total. In column K, there's a math total. And then for a grades ranking, English and math are 50-50. And again, all of the rankings will fall between 1 and 11, and it's the average, weighted average score for each school across the report card indicators. Starting in column M, if we scroll over, NWEA has the exact same format, and column W is the NWEA total ranking. Then that's what ends up feeding into the higher level ranking at the end. It all functions the same way. The weighting is the same for the state assessments, since there are only 2 years. And this is, we start to see the, like in columns AC to AF, we start to see the continuous and categorical variable combinations. The score is obviously a continuous variable. You can score 588, 589, 590, etc. And then you also have the percent who passed. In some schools, you have outliers on one end or the other that are pulling the mean up or down, and the percent who passed can be not necessarily correlate completely with the average score. So we include both there. If we have an ELA total for the 2 years of NYSED testing and a math total, those are aggregated at 50% each as well. And then to create a final academic score in column AI, that's report cards, NWEA and NYSED. Those are weighted at 40, 40, and 20. We only have half as many state tests to work with. And we have, especially earlier on, some opt-out and some consistency issues with the state test as well. But I definitely wanted to include it because it's such a critical accountability metric, and just, it's an important score regardless of how valid you think it is. The attendance domain starts in AJ. There's eight indicators in attendance. Each year has 2, which we talked about. The final ranking is I didn't weight attendance. That's just, those columns are weighted equally, so they're each 1/8 of the final ranking. Same thing for the discipline counts and behavior. Again, it's like we only have 1/4 of this year done, so I didn't want to overly weight the first 3 months of the year. And then the CSDA risk score finishes it off. We have 1 total. Each student has a total risk score that's assigned at the end of the year. And it actually is a running score that accumulates based on the student's performance during the year and behavior during the year. So a student kind of has a running total risk score. So I was able to use that for this year. And those are weighted 20, 20, 20, 40. For the gray columns are the ones that feed into the, whatever you want to call that, orange-ish, pinkish column, which is the final ranking for all the schools. And as I mentioned, that final ranking is weighted for 50% academic, 20 attendance, and then 15 and 15 behavior and risk. So you see, like Montessori at the top had a total ranking of 1.36 when you put all of it together. And the range is from there to Giffen at 9.57 in row 12. Then as a check on these rankings, the next sheet in the file that says data, and I've done a little work on this since, but this is, the initial pass on it. These are the numbers that created the rankings. So, report card grades are 1 to 4. These are the means that correspond to the ranking values you saw on the previous page. And I wanted to have this so that when we did group the schools, we'd be able to actually see the real data and what the percentiles would be, what the attendance percentages would be. So this is the same sheet, just has, if you scroll over, it has attendance percentages, discipline totals. Those are the state test scores. And obviously, when you do it this way, you can't aggregate. The reason we did rankings is because you have such disparate data sets with different types of numbers, different standardizations. You can't combine them, unless you standardize them through a ranking process. You can't combine them. So for the data piece itself, you don't end up with a final ranking. This is just as a check to make sure the rankings are working the way we want them to. On the third sheet, calculations. This, I ran a whole bunch of just hypothetical scenarios. And what this shows you, you can scroll to that way just to get there. Nope, the other way. Is that everything? Okay, yeah. So this in column B is the ranking, the aggregate ranking of, if you click on that cell, like cell B15, the one that says 5.98 B15, the cell itself, that formula up there weights the ranking by the group. So this is the columns that repeat themselves, column C, F, H, etc. Those are the numbers of students in the schools. And it's a little bit messy, but it was the easiest in terms of formulas to just put those in multiple places. So that formula tells you if you, and this is just a hypothetical, piloting, as I said, the model, Toast, Eagle Point, DCS, and Arbor Hill, if you combine them as a group, taking into account how many students are in there, so it's 206 students in those 4 schools. Each school has a different weight because they're different size. You end up with a final ranking of 5.98. So my first goal was to try and get those 3 numbers, the 598, 581, and 613, to be close. The idea being if they're not close, you're going to end up with very different data numbers, and that is what I found. This was the closest practice run that I had on the rankings, and then these are the corresponding data points that if, like I said, if these 4 cohorts of 5th graders had been grouped this way and gone to middle schools, this is what we would have seen as far as grades, NWEA, state test. And you see, like for the state test, there's less than 1 point difference among the schools. Attendance percentages are between 92 and 93 for all 3 schools. Discipline totals are within 11. And that CSDA risk marker is all, between 6.5 and 7. So this was a very equitable configuration. That doesn't mean it's necessarily workable. But all I need to do in that equation on the top is change some of those numbers, like 7s to 11s or 4s to 8s, and any combination we want to run, it'll just automatically change the numbers to show what the data will look like for that combination of schools. And then in the file that I have on my computer now, I'm just calculating ranges for each of these columns. So depending what grouping we look at, the highest attendance total minus the lowest attendance total, like what's the range? And we want those numbers to be as small as possible. So as a data-driven model, it gives us an opportunity anyway to quickly run a lot of different ideas and a lot of different hypotheticals. And then the last tab, distance, that was just for kind of transportation purposes. North Albany is not in a great location for one of 3 middle schools. It's the northeasternmost building in the district, and the closest elementary schools are Saspa, Giffen, and Arbor Hill. So we can't just go purely with transportation and convenience. But these are the distances to each middle school from each elementary school. So depending what groups we want to look at, we can just calculate kind of total driving distance among the groups. And then that 23 miles is actually the total for the sum of all three groups. And that's a number that I would just kind of put next to whatever scenario we decide we want to run. So in a nutshell, that's how it works. And this was kind of a quick, I'd like Excel files to be kind of cleaner and more readable and easier to interpret than this. So with a little more time, I think I can make it flow a little bit better. And certainly if we run scenarios, there'll be a way to present them so they're easy to compare and kind of pull out strengths and weaknesses for the various ideas. That's pretty much what I got.
Can I share one of the reflections on transportation that the committee had towards the end that I don't know how to convey it into this, but two things. One, the distance from the elementary school to the middle school is not particularly compelling as much as the distance each student has to go. And one of the things we asked for that I know the district transportation department already did, although there was some work still needing to be done to clean that data up, was the average distance looking student by student. If you fed SPA, say, to Myers, what the average travel would be for all existing SPA students. And in particular, we are sensitive in the district to students having to walk long distances. We only have a busing radius of 1.5 miles. So one of the insights from the committee work, and in particular, I'm going to credit this to Dan Katz, was that well, for fiscal reasons, we prefer to reduce transportation. For student equity and student academic success reasons, we prefer to reduce the number of students who are between 1 and 1.5 miles away from school, because less than 1 mile, they are a relatively manageable walk, safety, assuming it's a safe walk, and over 1.5, they are eligible for busing. So that danger zone of 1 to 1.5 is where we think, and again, this could be validated by comparing attendance data to current distance from school, but what our insight is that the 1 to 1.5 range is going to have a negative impact on students' attendance and thus their academic success. So we're really interested in that aspect of transportation rather than the distance from the school to the other school, because especially for our magnet schools, the students don't live at or near the school.
Mm-hmm. I thought about that for the magnet schools. That's would be much more valuable information to have to input. If we could get, this is based on address of residence, I assume, distance between residents to the attending school.
Well, what Ron's department did is they looked at their residential address and they calculated their distance to each of the 3 middle schools. And then they gave us all the possible scenarios. But there was a challenge with the data, Ron, and I don't know if you ever got to the bottom of that, where the number of attendees in the data that came out of that process didn't align to the number of attendees in the enrollment reporting that we get. And we couldn't quite figure out why that was. So it gave us a little bit of discomfort with the data. And I don't know, Ron, if you guys got to the next level on that. I
did talk with Dorette about that before the break, and I'll be honest, I don't recall what the upshot was. I don't think we came to a final understanding of what it was, what the reason for the discrepancy in the data was, but I'll revisit that.
And then can you also send Mr. Robin that very useful spreadsheet that you did for us towards the end with each of the elementary schools and the distance of their students to each of the middle schools?
Sure thing.
Are there any other questions?
Yeah, if I could. I mean, I think this is a great analysis of grades and kind of student, assessing students themselves. I mean, I think the model's pretty much just completely determined by your weights. So, I mean, the fact that you picked 50, 20, 15, 15, just that made the model. And so, I mean, I think there's some, I'd like to know more about why you picked that, because I mean, the way it ranked the schools, I'm not sure I would agree with or would think makes sense. But I guess putting that aside, I mean, it seems like at least that projection you put up would have changed almost every school. So one of the other things the committee talked about was limiting the number of alignment changes. That we were trying to say that you really can't change more than half the schools in the district. You can't set, you know, I know in a perfect world, if you changed all 12, you could probably get some result, but that you just, at least as we talked about it, we put in the amount of alignment changes as an important variable.
Well, first, this is not a proposed, so this is a practice model with the goal of optimal equity. So all this is to bring the numbers as close together as possible. It's not saying do this. It's just a practice in establishing equity. As far as the weights go, we can move the weights around and see how much it changes the model. I'm not sure how much it would, because as you know, there's a pretty high degree of correlation across these domains. But, you know, as I said, there's not a magic formula. I think I figured academics should probably be the most heavily weighted piece. But yeah, I'm happy to try it different ways if there are other ideas around the weighting. This is just kind of a first pass at it. And if it changes significantly, you know, that's something we'd have to think about as well.
I have two questions. Yeah, I agree with all of Dan's points. I had made similar notes here. So are you able with your model to run every possible mathematical scenario and say, okay, here are the 10 or the 50 closest in terms of equity to get those numbers the closest? Can you generate that so that then we can take that collection and say, okay, how many alignment changes? What does the transportation look like? Some of these other factors that the committee had determined were important to the community.
Yes, in theory. I mean, I will be happy to work with, you know, whoever wants to do it, because as I understand, there are certain permutations that don't really need to be explored because they're just not going to happen. But we can create a top 10 list, a top 20 list, whatever makes the most sense. So generally speaking, yes, we can run as many as we think is reasonable to run.
I guess, can I make one other point, or should I pause and let other people speak?
Go ahead.
One other thing, the idea of taking all this data and pushing it into rankings makes me a little uncomfortable. I think it sort of creates the system where it's like, and this is our #1 school in the district, and this is our bottom school in the district. And I understand there's a ton of data that's boiled down into that, and no one is implying that this is the best and this is the worst. But I think to put out to the community of teachers and parents and kids, you go to the best school, you go to the worst school, as opposed to here are the scores, here are the numbers. These are the average scores. It feels really different, and by pushing it all into rankings, the data behind all of it vanishes. So I just, you know, we had complex spreadsheets before, and you have way more data, and you've done this in a way that we didn't have the power to do, which is fantastic. I just wanted to pause and think about what it looks like to do everything based on rankings, which also hides some of the, like, these schools are actually really similar, but now they're sort of spread out into like equal space rankings on a list. So anyway,
that was actually the question that was a question I was going to ask Dorian anyway, which is that last part you had about the equal distribution, that, you know, by ranking 1 through 11 on each metric, it makes it hard to see where the variability is more than just a 10%, 10% down 1 through 11, you know, because there is quite a lot of variability. So, but I think I understood what you said at the end was that your intention is to put the real data back in after you get to the top few scenarios that you think are worth looking at based on the rankings. Now, I'm not sure, I'm still questioning whether that's the way to go, but at least I understood, I think, that you would then put the real data back in so that you could actually see things about the data itself rather than just the rank when we get down to comparing scenarios. Is that what you have in mind?
Yes, the rankings were really a guide, and I don't know that they need to be announced to, you know, families or anything. It was really to think about the resource demands across the student population of various schools, and maybe ranking is the wrong word, but generally speaking, the higher numbers in that column BF are schools that are going to require more intensive resources from the district. So as I understand, the problem, or one of the problems now with insufficient equity, is that it's difficult to allocate resources with that imbalance in certain student populations. So I'm trying to use the data. When I heard equity, my thinking was that the staff at these schools and those pillars of social supports and caregiver involvement and curriculum instruction, the demands will be spread out as evenly as possible across those three buildings. And these rankings kind of suggest if you take the student body coming out of certain elementary schools, there's just going to be different demands and different level of resource asks placed on those middle schools. And I'm trying to smooth that out.
I think that we are all in agreement about that piece. I think the question is the one that you posed earlier, which I think was really an important insight for us to all keep in mind, is that the question of whether the challenge is deep but narrow or shallow but widespread is really different, right? Those are two different schools. A school that's got 50% students who need very little resources and 50% students who need a tremendous amount of resources is a very different school than one that has most of their students kind of in the middle, even though if you look at average scores, they're going to be the same. And so that's what I'm wondering, how your model accounts for that and how we would see and be able to acknowledge which kind of schools we're looking at.
Well, I was hoping by including the two different kinds of variables and feeding those, they create the rankings. They're weighted to, in part, create the rankings. And then the data itself, the discipline incidence is just a total number. So I guess in that case, if it was a small number of kids with a high number of incidents, or a lot of kids with a lower number, you wouldn't see it there. But in the discipline ranking, we have the count and the percent with at least one discipline incident. So in some schools, you'll have a really high discipline count, but the percent with more than one is not that high. So that ranking would take those into account and be the average of the two.
Can we go back to that slide as you're talking about it?
Which slide?
We're on the ranking slide right now.
Oh,
It's a spreadsheet. It's a spreadsheet.
Yeah, I see. I'm still looking, and maybe it's just something wrong with my computer. I'm still looking at the addresses, the mileage.
Oh yeah, that's usually, I think.
Okay, so
you just have to click on the spreadsheet and it will come up on your screen. If you see it in a little bit of a small box at the bottom.
Ken, if you look at the rankings for each of those categories and just, do all the schools relatively spread out the same way, or are those distributions quite different as to a school is, on the left side in one and more like the right side in the other? Because I think that will introduce some sort of bias, right? When you do the weighting and influence the total score, especially with the academic data, where you have the NWE, the New York State test, where there might be higher opt-outs, as you mentioned. So if you just looked at the academic data, would the rankings play out the same? That doesn't matter.
What is the bias concern? If they are all the same or if they're not?
If they're not, if 1 year they're shifted one way or the other, and in between schools, those rankings change so much that when you take that in any particular category and you put a higher weight on that, now you've influenced. I haven't seen the spreadsheet until now. I'd like to, look at it more. But if you look at the, let's see, we have the report card, the NWE, and the New York State. Do all the schools sort of play out in the same order?
There's certainly themes where schools tend to gravitate towards the top, towards the middle, and towards the bottom. you do have some years and some indicators where there are outliers or changes that maybe you wouldn't predict.
Because
For the
if,
most
if
part,
any
they have-
particular column in each of these assessments is an outlier out of the ordinary, that's not what you see in other years, maybe we weight that less in that particular category. I mean, I haven't looked at the data before, so I don't know if that is what is happening, but I'm just asking the question.
Well, unless there's a reason to think that the data point is not valid, and if there is, then yeah, we should address that. But there are certainly fluctuation, legitimate fluctuations within buildings, within indicators. Could be, a change in teacher or just something that a building faced during the year that sometimes I don't know the context. I'll give principal data and the principal will say, oh yeah, my fourth grade, this happened this year and that's why these numbers changed from this to this.
And we've had interventions too, right, to address issues over the years. So, if more support was predicted, if one school went to, not in good standing and there were more resources devoted to bring it up to standing, that's going to change the way the outcome is. So,
and I was hoping by including a good amount of data and pulling from different areas, if there are some of those anomalies, it wouldn't really change the data or impact the rankings significantly. So we're not just kind of putting all our eggs in one or two.
So that's what I'm asking. Does it or does it not change the ranking? Because
not a lot, no.
Okay.
I mean, because you have 42 indicators and those get aggregated into, I think, like a second tier of 9 rankings and then 4 and then 1. By the time you get to that final ranking, a couple of anomalies in specific areas are not all that impactful anymore.
and we definitely, I think, should look at the distance to see how much we want to weight that too, because as Anne and Dan mentioned in the previous meetings, that we really want to look at the distance between, because a student could be going to a school now, but they could be at, bus to that school, but the middle school could be closer to their house and they're no longer bus. So there are all these, one's less accessible versus more accessible in the future. So looking at the address of that each student and where it potentially would end up. I'm hoping Ron will send you that data with the 1 mile, 1 to 1.5 mile and the greater than 1.5 mile to sort of see how much weighting should we add to that as well.
I think I can delete the distance sheet from this file after this meeting, and we'll start with the more meaningful data.
I forgot something actually. Go ahead.
You're muted.
Muted.
Thank you. I didn't say anything much anyway because I was trying to put my thoughts together, so that was helpful that I muted there. Talking about transportation reminded me of my original question about DCS and dual, and that there's a factor that I think is important that needs to be included, because we all know that one of the important things is that the schools be roughly the same size when all is said and done, right? We think at least that we want to have limited variability in size of school, or if there's variability, I think we would want it to be variability that increases equity, right? So that the school with the least performance has the least good performance has the fewest students, so they get the most resources per student. But in any case, one of the things that's changing in the district is that the dual language program is going to be doubled in size. Mm-hmm. So if you were to use this year's dual 5th graders, you'd be under calculating roughly 60 students in the ultimate size of the middle school, right? Because we're going to have a second class full of 5th graders, 6th graders, 7th graders, 8th graders. So it's roughly 20 students times 3 years, roughly 60 students. So it makes a pretty significant impact on the ultimate school size. So I'm not sure how you want to factor that in, because it's hard to then subtract them someplace else. Although, as we all know, our enrollment projections are wildly crazy from year to year as the refugees come and go and charter schools open and close. So the overall number is fictitious to some extent anyway, but the proportion of dual students is going to increase over the next couple of years. So I didn't know if you thought that through.
I had heard, yes, that the school that's absorbing the dual program should be the smallest to start, it seems, and we need to leave it some room to grow into equity. I don't know how else you would really address that, except to say that it's going to have fewer kids for the first couple of years. And I guess it would need an additional, if this model is just including this year's fifth graders, it would lead an additional 40-ish slots because it would be getting 20 extra for the next 2 years.
Right. I mean, the other way to look at it is to take, and I don't know if this is a reasonable way, you're the statistician, not me, but if you take every student record that's a current dual student and you copy it and paste it back at the bottom of the spreadsheet, so you've got real dual student A, fictitious dual student A1, that would perhaps be something worth considering, because it's not just that there's more dual students, it's that their data is different, we think, than the surrounding school. So, you know, that there's both the quantity of students and the way they impact the rankings of the ultimate middle schools that I'm sensitive to.
Okay.
And with regards to distance, you know, I also don't know if we should think about weighting non-magnet versus magnet differently, because as it is right now, magnet is through a lottery. You could be in any part of town and, you know, drive or have a bus. It's different from a neighborhood school where kids are going to something within that 1.5 distance if possible. So if they are put to a different school, how does that play into the picture?
I would concur with that thought, Dr. Chatur, that we have two different groups with the magnet and neighborhood school, and parents oftentimes chose specifically for a specific reason. So if you chose Ash and distance was not, you know, an issue, you would choose, you know, a school that might have been further away than your neighborhood school. So I think, and that's maybe something that we would need to get more data on about, you know, we know we do have that data actually about how important distance or closeness for our parents is, but we should try to have that as a layer over this, so that maybe if you were sent to, if you are being sent to a magnet school, there's a different weight for distance, for example.
I think it's while the magnet schools certainly have students that are spread out, based on the sort of scatter plot maps that we were given before it's amazing how much the neighborhood schools have often surprising scatter. Like that's Pine Hills, that's a neighborhood school. Obviously you can't see it really well, but like those students are all over the city. And my understanding is there were situations where students went to North Albany and that school was closed and some of them were put at Pine Hill. So there's all kinds of complicated stories behind why the students are spread out. But I think we need to look at that spread in some ways the same way for everybody. We just need to look at what the distances are, and then we want to try to maximize the number of students going to a middle school who live within a mile of that middle school. Obviously, we can't do that for everybody, and obviously there'll be busing, but that's a value that we hold, that we want to try to, as much as possible, we value having students live close to their middle school. And again, North Albany is far for almost everyone, but we can still choose the better options instead of the worse options.
And I want to stress again that our second choice is that you live over 1.5 miles away. And only the third choice is that you live 1 to 1.5 miles, because it's better to get a bus than to have to walk 1.4 or provide your own transportation 1.4.
Does it make sense to consider the distance between the elementary school and the middle school? So if a parent is already bringing their student to Toast, for example, the closeness of Toast to Hackett, you know, should that factor be included in the decision making?
My personal opinion is that that's the kind of nuanced conversation we could have once we get down to 10 or 12 scenarios, because I can see why it would make a factor, because families are always going to have children, or there will always be families that have children at multiple schools, right, at the elementary school and at the middle school. So in some sense, it's very convenient if you're dropping off your middle schooler to also drop off your elementary student in that same neighborhood, or to have your middle schooler walk your elementary student home. So I could see that being a factor when we're closer. Personally, I would not put that as a primary factor, because I think that has too much potential to disrupt our overall primary goal of equitable and similar stat middle schools.
Well, and kind of like what you just said about waiting until we get to scenarios, I'm in no way saying that the transportation piece is not important. It's one of the most important, but I'm almost wondering if we might have to table transportation till we get some scenarios. I don't think any kind of weighted score, that's not saying anything against the weight it's here. I think if we use this information to come up with some ideal scenarios and then factor transportation back in to figure out of, if we end up with like 25, we can then narrow that 25 down to 10, because we can say, oh, all this these transportation scenarios are, the 1.5 versus more than 1.5 is what's going to make a difference. I don't know if we'll be able to, I think it would be a lot of work to try and come up with scenarios with transportation into consideration, as opposed to coming up with scenarios without the transportation and then narrow those scenarios down using transportation data as part of the factors.
And if I can just a little more on how we were doing the decision. I mean, I think I think we kind of thought of the decision very much like a funnel, that like the first cutoff point was grades, and then below that was, or the first cutoff point was population, like it had to be balanced, and then there were grades, and there were alignment changes, and that, transportation was definitely far down the list, but that like it wasn't averaging everything together all at once. It did kind of have some, you have to have a balanced population, and then you have to have balanced grades, and then you have to have a certain amount of alignment changes, that it wasn't so total, I guess. So
Can I clarify something? Because I'm a little lost in terms of in looking for different scenarios. The primary goal in looking for the scenarios to create schools that are numerically balanced, right? Like there's a reasonable population of students in those schools, that they are equitable in terms of these different data points that we've discussed. And is there a particular combination of schools that we're looking for? Because other than changing the different schools that are in the buckets, you're not going to get more balance than what was already put through the model unless we change the weightings of things. I'm confused in terms of looking for more scenarios, what exactly we're looking for. Because right now, as I look at it, if we go back to Eon, M&J O'Neill, and you look at the combination of schools, these schools, other than 4, aren't really changing the schools that they've been with all the time.
So I think, Cecily, we're all assuming that what Dr. Robbins showed was not an actual scenario, but that was a placeholder test that he ran, because we know that at a minimum dual has to be pulled out and rethunk and recalculated, right? So I don't think any of us are acting on the assumption that there's one recommendation. I think we are thinking, and I hear what you're saying, that yes, equitable distribution in numbers is number one. I think this is actually, you and Dan said very similar things just now, that the number one criteria. So if you take all of the possible scenarios, you first have to discount any that don't have roughly equitable sizes, right? Equal sizes, right? That's number one, right? And that's going to get rid of a whole bunch of the many thousands and thousands of scenarios that there are. And then you're going to get rid of those that have wildly inequitable distribution of schools, right? Where you have all of our high performing schools at one middle school and all of our low performing schools at another. Those would be instantly distributed, right? Discarded. And then adding in the new data, which I think Mr. Robin had access to, which we did not previously, which is like attendance and behavior data, right? You're also going to discard any that have wildly inequitable or imbalanced. Inequity is a tricky word there. Let's say imbalanced attendance or behavior data. But I think two of the questions that the committee struggled with as I watched the committee meetings were, how important are these microscopic changes, right? Like if the difference in the test scores is 1/100%, does that make it a better scenario than one that's 100% worse in terms of equity, but in all other ways is better for our community? So it's better transportation, it's fewer changes, it's got a lot of these sort of soft things. So numerically, if people were computers, you could say this is the best one. but that we also all know that there's a lot of variability in the data from year to year. So you're taking an average over multiple years, and well, maybe what if that school just had an off year, and if it's 1/100%, is that really what we want to be basing this long-term decision on, or does it need to have a more nuanced conversation than that? So I don't know, does that help you understand or think through what we're trying to say?
I mean, I guess I'm wondering, and maybe it's more of a question for Dr. Robin, like, I imagine based on the multiple data points that sit in here that there aren't a tremendous number of scenarios that are going to arrive at equitable school and balanced schools and that check all those boxes. And so I guess that's why my question back was, is there a specific configuration of schools that we're looking to put together that has some other anecdotal value to the committee, right? So we've talked about the transportation piece or being close to home, or like, I guess I'm just missing some piece of that.
So I can interject with that. I'll take that. So Dr. Wilson Turner, one of the things that we are looking at is, yes, we have the hard numbers, but we also know in practicality, what are our resources? We have to look at some of those soft skills, or I shouldn't say soft skills, some of those other factors that the community has brought in that are important to them. Remember, we haven't even shared
I guess I'm
scenarios with those, and what those determining factors are right now. That's what the public discussion is about, so that we can get to that point. It's not about tonight saying this is the one scenario. We understand this is a draft going through based on this data, but now that we have the mathematical piece, now what are those components that we have received from our surveys that our community and this group, our committee, have said it's important that we look at, and I'm going to pick on distance because I think we're all just picking on distance right now, but what are those other factors that have come to us through our surveys that say these are things that are also important? How do we now overlay that with some of the numerical data that we have, and in essence kind of merge the two pieces together to come up with the best scenarios possible to recommend to the board?
And I think that's what I'm trying to clarify. Like, how are we arriving at different scenarios if the numbers, like, what are those other factors besides transportation, which I'm clear on, right? I'm clear that we're going to look at mileage differently, and that may impact what those are. Besides the size of the school, besides, you know, the academics, the behavior, the intent, like all of these metrics that have been pulled in, what else does Dr. Robin need to know in his model, or is it not even about the model anymore? Is it just about there's some factors that you want to be able to play with, and then he's going to go back and plug them in? I'm just trying to get clear on where
I
we
think
go
you're
next.
still trying to understand them. I mean, I think there's two questions happening. I think that's why it's confusing, is that there's two different conversations. One is a conversation about the model, and the other is the conversation, because I think, well, first of all, let me take yet another meta step back. I think the way the process is going to work is that the model is going to generate some small number of scenarios, and the model is not going to generate a single scenario, because that would assume that the model had perfect knowledge, and we all know it doesn't have perfect knowledge, right? It has a bunch of data that we're manipulating. So it's going to generate some small number of scenarios that are reasonably equitable and balanced in all the ways, right? That's it's going to happen, and we're going to get those data. And then there'll be a second phase where there will be some conversation about among those few scenarios, and so there's two conversations. One is, how do we get the model? What is the model going to look like to get us to that first set? And then the question you're asking now, I think, is what are the factors that get us from that, let's call it the top 10, to the final determination?
And I think maybe I might be being more linear about it, that this combination of rankings is going to give you a numbers wise a top scenario, right? A most balanced scenario, a scenario that's most equitable, that has the rankings fall out just right. Like, it's going to give you that one thing. So I guess you're saying let's look at the top 10 or look at the top 50 of those combinations, I guess, is what I'm trying to clarify.
Because I think, and this is what I would really like to hear from Dr. Robin on this too, but I think if you take the very top one it may be only microscopically better than the top two, the second one, the third one, the fourth one, the fifth one, that there's really a set of plausible ones that are plausibly similar, and that the data is not so tight that you can actually say the first one is better than the second one. It just happened to be better today, but if we ran it once we get the NWEA scores for the next set of NWEA scores, it might make the second one better than the first. There's like going to be a plausible number. And then some of these factors that the committee has really brought to our attention, like the number of changes, like if the top one is 0.01% better than the second one, but requires changing 9 schools, and the second one only requires changing 3 schools, I don't think that the, that's a straw man, right? That's not a reasonable, but that's just to make the case really strong. I don't think any of us would say for that 0.01%, we need to make the entire district, every single parent needs to learn a new drive to school. Like that's kind of like, that just seems unreasonable to me. So I think there's a set, and I don't know how big that set is. And that's where I think some of us are uncomfortable with like the way the model is using rankings, because we're not really sure how is that going to result in the sets. Like it's just like that's that first conversation about how are we going to get to the set. So does that help you see where at least I think most of us are coming from?
Yes, you're looking for a range of, I was just thinking that the range of options wouldn't be that big. And so that is a question for Dr. Robin, like what would be the gap between the next 10 scenarios?
And also, since we're looking at the spreadsheet for the first time, we're trying to understand how the weights applied, are they meaningful for the model? Because eventually, once we all agree that, yes, this is a reasonable weighting and these numbers look reasonable, then you approve the model, and the model can be used to generate the 10 or 50 scenarios, whatever we decide. And then we start asking those other questions that I mentioned.
Can I add another question here before Dr. Robin actually, walks us through all of this? I wonder, to the weightings question, we're giving achievement 50%, and then everything else, the remaining 50%, we're breaking it down to attendance and behavior. And we know that there is a very big correlation between attendance and behavior and scores, right? That one affects the other. And I'm wondering whether it would be valuable to see if we weighted them differently, what would that give us?
We could, yes. I mean, mathematically, with the equations, I could change the weights. Yeah, I probably shouldn't hypothesize. I don't think the order of the schools would change dramatically because of the correlation you just referred to. Part of the weighting, I didn't want really old data to influence things too much. I tried to weight more complete, cleaner data sets a little more heavily, just knowing on the, what's that? Oh, I'm hearing myself, never mind. But yeah, I mean, in answer to your question, we could do 25% in each of the 4 major domains and see how drastically it changes things. The weights are just to try and, skew things a little bit more towards more current, from my understanding of the data, more relevant and pertinent information. So it's like I said, it's not set in stone. I would love this model to be better and better with every iteration. So within the realm of possibility, we can try things.
So I understand weighting the scores themselves. You can average the years, however, but I guess I'm not. Why are you weighting the attendance and behavior? Like, why not just have them be? We need the range of behavior to be similar, and why are they connected in your model?
So that each school would have a single score, and I can create 3 groups with the same score. And that's what works, I think, pretty well when I created the groups and then equated it to the actual data if those students were in schools together.
But you could just do it to all of and not have to create groups. You could just create every scenario and then say, I want a variance of this, and I don't want the schools to be more than this, and I don't want behavioral incidents to vary by more than this. That you could do it to every scenario. I'm curious why you're weighting and averaging and doing it that way.
It was easier. And on the sheet with calculations, I have a total of behavior, and I have it broken out so I can see actual data with each grouping, what the range is for grades, for discipline incidents, and for attendance percentage, and for risk scores. So I have that information, and that would be presented to all of you for each scenario. So I think we arrive at the same place. On this sheet, the domains are kept separate. If that sort of makes more sense to people, I can put the separate rankings with each scenario as well.
I think it's also important that we shift our thinking a little bit about ranking not meaning better or worse. And I think as I'm listening to the conversation, I hear that struggle of trying to equate the ranking with better or worse. And I don't think that that's the intent. And so maybe we do change that language so that it's not easily confused with being better or worse, because I think that's one of the things. I do think that we are looking at a different methodology, which is fine. It's not to say that one methodology is right or wrong. It's just the way of looking at it so that the information could be shared in this way so that we could see it in a different way, and look at it in comparison to the things that we've already done. One of the things that I would like to do is I want to go back and touch base a little bit on what Dr. Wilson Turner was talking about in terms of what would those discrete differences be. When we look at where we are, we have to make sure that we go back to our surveys and see what our community felt was important, and then how do we, as we work through this process, take into account what the priorities were from our families. And academic programming, which directly relates to, and the academic equity, those two pieces were rated very high, and that does relate to some of the aggregation that you see with regard to the test scores, the behavioral pieces. It does relate to that. When we look at attending school closer to home, we know that that was extremely important. How would we be able to factor that particular piece in? Bus eligibility as a priority, it was not very important, but when you look at very important and neutral, it was a little bit over 50% of the respondents. And understand, we have to go back out with this information to see how this relates with a significant portion of our population that we did not hear from. And so these are some of those things that we have to look at, even with the statements about bus eligibility versus being closer to home. 77% preferred closer to home, whether or not they were eligible for a bus anyway. So those are those priorities that we haven't necessarily captured, but we are able to now quantify and then blend the two processes together, as well as get that feedback from our families so that we can see how the scenarios might be generated in the future.
So yeah, I think that last part that you said about the way that the survey responses were not representative of our district has made me really question the reliability and value of those survey responses. I'm hesitant to build much in based on a very narrow set of our district.
But we have to go back out, and we've consistently said that we're going to go back out, and that's from the committee as well. From the beginning, we've stated that. But this at least gives us a little peek into it. We know that it's probably going to change, but this at least gives us a peek to say, even though we know we have to go back out, how do we incorporate these things as we are trying to get that quantified? It at least starts that process of us thinking about, regardless of what the additional input says, we need to be able to think about how this is going to impact the results that we have and what we're looking at in terms of our scenarios.
So I understand what you said. I want to drive the question, the conversation back to the model, because I know Dr. Robin really needs to figure out what he's going to do next and what his marching orders are. And there was one idea that we haven't talked about at all that his original memo inspired in me, and I just wanted to get it on the table so he could react to it, or other people could react to it. And that was the use of the risk score that the district has been using student by student. Like, that was such a really important thing that I don't think ever came up in either board or committee conversation until we saw your memo, Dr. Robin. So I really appreciated that. And it goes back to that question of deep but narrow or wide but shallow that you mentioned before. And I almost wonder, and feel free to tell me this is a terrible idea, but I wonder if that risk factor is not actually the most important piece of data that we've got, because it already incorporates all of the other things that the administrators and the teachers have said are important, right? That's why they use that risk factor. And so if you could just define equity rather than, as you did, similar rank, right, on average, similar rank, or as the committee was before, which was similar average scores, which was what we had to work with, but rather if you could define equity as similar % of the student body at each risk level. And I don't know what the risk levels are, but I'm just going to assume you could break them into, say, 5 buckets of very low risk, neutral risk, high risk, and very high risk. And if your schools each had a similar shape to whatever that histogram was, then that would look like equitable schools in terms of the amount of resources that they would require. Do you understand? Did I actually say that in a way that made sense to you?
Yes.
Okay, and is that worthy of consideration?
I'm going to tell you that's a terrible idea. The risk scores, as you saw, currently comprise 15% of the total for the schools. I like the risk score a lot. As I said, my 2 points of hesitation on that would be, number one, that it's a locally built and derived metric. It's not standardized, and how the points are allocated it's not like a proven or psychometrically tested metric.
Okay.
I think it's good, and I think Tricia, given what she had to work with, did a great job with it. The other is that eggs in one basket thing. Yes, it has the virtue of encompassing aspects of all of the other domains that are already in there, actually, and then some. But if we build the whole model off of a single data point for each student, then if there is something systematically strange or occasionally inconsistent with that metric, that error completely, there's no safety net there. That said, I can again just see how different things play out with these different approaches. I don't know, I'm keep offering to do different, I don't know what our timetable is, but it would be informative to know if the schools kind of group the same ways when we try it different ways. And if they don't, then it would be worth looking into why they don't and what the difference is in the different calculations are.
And communicating the scenarios to each other and to the public, looking at that, what in my mind is a histogram of groups of students, might be a way for people to really understand it, right? You could really I think you can get a mental picture, whereas saying that the average NWEA score is 279 doesn't mean bupkas, I think, to most people. Mm-hmm. Seeing a little histogram that says low number of very at risk, low number of very not at risk, medium number of at risk students, and having those histograms look roughly the same for each middle school, which I think, as you were describing, you kind of, after you do whatever it is that we do to get to the model, and then you unpack it and put the real data in, you could create those histograms for each middle school. And if they were not similar, that would be eye-opening and concerning from a resource allocation perspective, as even if we don't use it to build the model, as we use it to unpack it and compare those last 10, 20, whatever that number is going to be, that might be another way to use that insight.
Okay, we would just create quintiles with the total risk scores.
Who said something? Somebody asked a
Sorry,
question.
can someone tell us what the factors are that go into that risk score or whatever it's called?
I can. There are a lot. Let me.
While you're pulling that up, I just was going to mention, and I don't want there to be extra unnecessary work, but, and this was alluded to, I'm almost wondering if we can get some scenarios, some actual example scenarios, not a ton, but like using the 15, 15, 50, and 20, here's like 2 example scenarios. And then like you said, 25, 25, 25, and 25, and here's another set. And just to start helping us see how these different data points can lead into a scenario, even if it's not our top 10 yet.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's a reasonable next step would be to, try it out and create some scenarios that seem to look good. And then maybe add some of those other points around transportation and change of feeder school, and let all of you kind of assess whether you think the information is useful and if it makes sense to you.
And
Mr. Rob,
make sure we're cautious around the transportation piece, because we do have a significant population that is transient. And so when Mrs. Adams talked about who completed the survey and wanted to live next door to their school, like the majority of them are in stable homes. And so I just want to put some caution around that, or an asterisk, as we look at those transportation numbers.
That's absolutely true. I think that we had arrived at the idea that we didn't want more than 5 changes or maybe 6 changes. Is that accurate? I think this is a question especially for Ann and Dan, who were playing around with this stuff. And I think that whatever that number is may be helpful for Mr. Robin to just be able to say, okay, we're screening that right out from the top.
I actually did that the other way. I know that was sort of what you guys did when you were working on the committee before I got involved. I am hesitant about making that a primary thing, because I think if there were, back to Cecily's question, if you ran all the scenarios, and the number 1 scenario required us to move every single school, which it wouldn't, right? Because that would be mathematically silly, because you could just move some of them back and keep the groups the same, but let's just pretend. And it was so much more equitable, so much better distribution than the second scenario down. I think we'd have to seriously consider it, right? I don't think that's a real possibility. I think in reality, once we get to the top group, there'll be a chunk of them. And then we can say, look, all of these scenarios are basically the same in terms of the equitable distribution of students. And these 2 require us to move 11 schools. So we're going to toss those, right? So I think it's a secondary criteria from my perspective, because I think the goal is equity first, lack of impact on district parents and families. Really, that's important. I don't mean to suggest it's not important, but I think there'll be so many equitable scenarios that we'll be able to find ones that don't require so much in the second pass. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I agree, Anne. I do think that not making too many changes is important, but I think it was Dan that was talking about the funnel. The not making changes is further down the funnel for me than making changes.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Robin, I had a quick thought, and you could tell me how feasible it is. So could we incorporate our current feeder pattern and see where it would stack up in terms of the
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
When I ran the scenarios, I absolutely did that. I put the current feeder pattern so you could compare it, and we absolutely have to do that. And the reality is the current feeder pattern is entirely inequitable, and it will be almost any scenario that we would consider would be radically better than what we've got now. So yes, we should do that. And I'm sure Mr. Robin plans to do that. So, but it's unthinkable that any scenario that we would consider would not be substantially better.
Very good.
And now
but it's also
Oh, go ahead, Marie.
It's also not, I mean, currently, and forgive me if I'm wrong, North Albany has fewer students, right? So it's not, right, so it's not even, to me, that's like, we shouldn't, that should not be it, period, done, away with, that should not be the case, right? So.
No, yeah, population wise, the current feeder pattern, just on population, it can't stay. But I do like having, when we were doing our, our version of scenarios, I really liked having that comparison to look at. I liked having that on the side just to be able to see, like, wow, it, it didn't really do that much of it. Scenario A didn't do that much, but scenario B was like, wow, look at how much better it did for the schools. I liked having that comparison. And I think that'll make a difference when we're trying to explain to families why it can't stay the same. Having that side by side, why it can't stay the same. Because I know a lot of people wanted it to stay the same, and just describing population alone, they were kind of like, wow, I get, I'm starting to get, like, I don't like it, but I'm starting to get it.
Yeah.
So I would like to interject now. We are at 7:36 and we are at the end of our time, but I want to make sure that we are on the same page. I have three.
Before you wrap up, Dorian's question is still on the table. Dr. Robin was going to give the list of things.
What question was that? I'm so sorry.
The list of things that are incorporated in the risk score, and we got distracted.
Okay.
So if he could do that, then we can go on to next steps.
Okay, I'm sorry. I totally forgot
no,
that.
The conversation kind of went like this.
I will give an overview because it's a long list and a somewhat involved calculation. It's built along the lines of, for attendance, you get points are assigned. If your attendance percentage is less than 80, you have 2 points. If it's between 80 and 90, you have 1 point. If it's above 90, you have no points for attendance risk. Disciplines, you can get up to 4 points if you have greater than 20 disciplines, and there are tiers like that. There are course failures. For above elementary, there's credit earned. NWEA's in there. IEP or 504, you can earn 1 or 2 points. ELL, well, it says free reduced lunch, but I guess eco status would be a point. Retention, and then suspensions. This is an older file from Tricia. We were kicking around mobility and homelessness and how that could or couldn't be worked in. I'm honestly not sure where she landed on that, but I'll get an update on the risk calculation procedure that she's using for like the last year. But anyway, those are the domains and generally how she scores it.
So is free and reduced lunch the only socioeconomic? There isn't a separate socioeconomic. It's just sort of
not
like
in this
one
list.
or a
That
zero.
I've seen.
Yeah, free and reduced lunch or none.
Dr. Robin, didn't you just mention economically disadvantaged?
Yes.
Which
But
is beyond.
It was 2 names for the same column, I think. Like
Yeah.
maybe the column is titled.
This is older. It says free and reduced lunch, but that doesn't really have much meaning. So it would be the economically disadvantaged status.
And,
Yeah, it's
and
all
if,
one category.
yeah, but economically disadvantaged, if the district is using the same definition as the state does, it includes a whole bunch of things.
Correct.
And that's a yes, no, economically disadvantaged or not. There's no gradation there. Is that right?
Yep. That's a 0, 1, at least in this iteration of the calculation that I'm looking at, it's 0 or 1.
Because that's what the state gives. It's a like when you look at graduation rates, you get econ, not econ.
Right.
That's it. ELL, not ELL. That's it. Okay, thank you very much. So back to you, Superintendent. You were doing the thing you do and trying to get us back on track.
So I want to make sure that we have the correct information with what the committee is looking for now. We want to make sure that even though it's not the top priority, the distance, we do want to include that with the information that the district did provide with the scatter plots about from home to the location, not school to school. The second thing is looking at the number of changes from the current feeder pattern, that comparison. And then also looking at the use of the at-risk score, and making sure that even if we don't change it, looking at that histogram to see how many quote at-risk students would be in one building versus another, so that we can see how that plays out. So those are the top 3 things that I've heard from this discussion that we would be looking for Dr. Robin to work with.
The only thing you didn't include was pulling out dual.
Oh, pulling out dual,
And
absolutely.
hopefully doubling it in some way so that it correctly projects into the potential school size.
Correct.
Right, and also balanced school sizes. Is that already part of the model, or does that need to be added on?
It's already part of it, but we definitely will look at that.
And I don't know if this fell on one of the categories you talked about, Superintendent Adams, but the, sorry, I totally lost my train of thought. Oh, the looking at possible differences between the current weight versus a different set of weights. Like how different is it if you gave everything 25% versus?
And I think that's built in because he has the different weights that he's already presented. So that part I think is built in.
And I do think Dan has mentioned this a couple times, and I would love to hear Dr. Robbins, after he's had a little bit of time to reflect on it, talking about the use of ranking versus criteria. So because the question of ranking does seem to compress some of our variability somewhat. And whether that's the best way to decide if the schools are equitably balanced, or if some other way of doing it by, just like a complicated if-then sort of statement. If the academics are within this range and the attendance is in this range kind of criteria, whether that would come out the same as the ranking.
I think that's where we end up. So I think we almost can skip the rankings as a step. That helped me know sort of what the most likely groupings would be that would yield equitable data. But when I was looking at, the hypothetical groupings that I ran, I looked at the actual data. I did look at the behavior, the attendance, the grades separately. And that's where I thought the rankings were working well, because the closer the groupings were in that ranking, the closer they were in the actual data scores. So it's just 2 ways of arriving at the same place, but it sounds like everybody likes to see the actual data better, separated out by those domains, and you will. I'm probably going to be the only one who uses those rankings because they're just a good starting point for me to.
But you are going to do whatever the model is, you are going to run it against all plausible scenarios, right? You're not just going to pick 50 or 20 that you think are possible. You're going to run.
That I do not want the scenarios to come from my head at all.
Okay.
But I will like some assistance in defining what a plausible scenario is, because my understanding is there are certain considerations that would be automatic disqualifiers and certain things that have to be. And if I can get that list, that just narrows what the permutation.
Right. I mean, I think the only one I'm aware that this committee has established with certainty is that they have to be within a realm of a reasonable enrollment difference of each other. That's a plausible. When I say plausible scenario, I mean 3 middle schools roughly the same size. And what roughly means, I don't know. Does that mean a variable of 25, 35?
Also, all struggling students ending up in the same school.
Say it again.
All struggling students ending up in the same school.
Oh, right. The balance. But in terms of,
go ahead, Ann.
I was just saying, sort of cutting the number from the ridiculous number that the combinatorics gets us to a number that becomes the thing that doesn't crash your Excel spreadsheet. Enrollment is the number one thing.
Right. And because we need, the dual program is going to be a 12th school, but it's much smaller than the other 11 schools. So for the group that has, I guess it would be four, the group that has dual and 3 other schools, those 3 other schools are probably going to have to be among the larger elementary schools to keep
Well, Jewel and Montessori are going to be the exact same size, right? We're
I
going
think we need to allow the runs to go, and then we can start analyzing them once we have the runs of the scenarios, and then those can be shared out. And then we can balance it against what the criteria is that we've talked about. And then we can definitely make sure that these items are included. And Dr. Robin, I think I'll be willing to work with you as well as Dr. Wilson Turner. I think we've captured from the committee, and then we'll be able to help navigate that with you. Okay?
Yes, great.
Thank you all so very much. I don't want us to get cut off mid-sentence, so I want to say thank you all so very much. And again, you can email any additional questions that you may have. And thank you all so very much for your work. We appreciate everything. Great session tonight. Love the discussion. Awesome, awesome. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Your input, everybody. Nice to meet you.